Good morning to all. Myself Dr. K. Manoharan, Associate Professor, Department of Biomedical Engineering. So today class we are going to discuss about interrupt sources. So the interrupt sources available in 8051 that we are going to discuss. So then 8051 we have 5 interrupt sources will be available. Look at this. First one, timer 0 overflow. So that means whenever the timer 0 overflows, this interrupt will be occurred. So next will be timer 1 overflow. So whenever timer 1 overflows, this interrupt will be occurred. So where we are using a counter or timer, so once it will be overflows, that corresponding interrupt will be occurred. Next will be external interrupt 0 and external interrupt 1. So here we can use some sensors or some other external sources to interrupt a microcontroller that will be connected to this interrupt lines. So we have two lines will be available, external interrupt 0 line and external interrupt 1 lines. And then another interrupt, this is serial port interrupt. Actually this will be used for an both directions. So that means, so we use a full duplex concepts. That means simultaneously we transmit the data and simultaneously we receive the data. So whenever we receive the data, so once that 8 bit is received, the data should be copied so that the next data can be started receiving. So once the buffer is filled, so we need to copy the data to resume the receiving operation. Similarly, whenever you are transmitting, so whenever transmitting, if the 8-bit data is completely transferred, the buffer becomes empty. So once the buffer becomes empty, again we need to load the data to continue the transmission operation. So even though we have an one register SBO, but actually it have a two registers. So one is a read-only register and another is a write-only register. So one will be used for a transmission and another one will be used for a receiving. So for an transmission register, we write the data, actual data will be started transmitting. Once that register becomes empty, so it gives an interrupt. So once it gives an interrupt, again we load the next data to continue the data transmission. Similarly in receiving operation, so once the receiver is enabled, it starts receiving the data. So once the complete 8-bit data is received, the buffer becomes full. So once the buffer is full, it will be indicated by an interrupt. So once it is an indicated interrupt, so we copy the data. So once the data is copied, the buffer becomes empty. So it start receiving the next data. Even though we are saying that this is a buffer empty or filled, that is a receiving interrupt or a transmitter interrupt, but practically that we have an only serial port 1 interrupt. So what we do means, once this serial port interrupt is occurred, we go and check whether this is a transmitter interrupt occurs or receiver interrupt occurs. This is a transmitter interrupt means, so the transmission we need to load a next data. Once the receiver interrupt occurs, so the receiving operation is completed, we copy the data to receive a next data. So once the serial port interrupt occurs, so we need to perform whether this is the receiver interrupt or a transmitter interrupt. Based on that, we need to perform that particular task. So this is the basic version of 8051. If we go with an enhanced versions, so we have up to 24 interrupt sources will be available. So that means it have a more number of timers. So each timer we use one interrupt. Again we have this counter arrays, ADCs, external interrupts and serial port interrupts. So these up to 22 sources of this. This is we have an 8051 basic version. So for other versions 8252, again 8250, 8055, we have so many versions. So that versions we have a more number of interrupt sources. So the interrupt process, if the interrupt event is occurred, so that it will be have an and with an interrupt flag, that is an event is enabled. For example, if your interrupt is occurred, only if it is an enabled, that interrupt will be considered. So that's why we are performing AND operation. So this is an interrupt event and then there is an interrupt flag will be enabled. So only this is an AND operation. So AND operation means if the both cases are one only, it gives an one logic. So if it is an enabled and if it receives an interrupt, the interrupt will be served. So once that interrupt is occurred, what we do? So we need to current program counter value will be pushed into stack, because then only we can return back to the where it is called. Again, the program execution continues to the interrupt vector address. So that ISR, that is interrupt service routine, will be loaded from an interrupt vector address and it will be start executing. So after completing that interrupt, we have one instruction called RETA, return from an interrupt. That is, return is RET. This is VN RETIA. That means return from an interrupt. So whenever we have this RETA instruction, so the program counter will be popped from a stack pointer and that will be loaded to the program counter. So what happens, where it is stopped, from that it will be resumes and start executing. Thank you.